Hello, welcome to the first video of two webinars dealing with post-colonial writings and critical theory. In the first video, I will focus on the historical basis of colonialism and will mention briefly how the post-colonial context emerged in different locations. I will attend to British colonial territories in particular and to the literary efforts that have emerged after independence. Although some of the writers mentioned also contributed to the critical debate, the second video will explore in more detail the fundamental aspects of post-colonial critical theory. In the first sense in which the term post-colonial emerges is to describe the state in which different societies and nations found themselves after formal decolonization and independence. Post-colonialism in this sense is a historical, legal, and political term, and deeply contested. If post-colonialism is understood in terms of historical periodization in relation to a specific set of political struggles, then one of the questions that emerges is what is or was colonialism? Chandra Mohanty argues that, and you have the definition on your screen, colonialism almost invariably implies a relation of a structural domination and a suppression, often violent, of the heterogeneity of the subjects in question, the establishment of a permanent settlement abroad as a means of dispossessing other political communities from their land and as a strategy of securing political control over foreign people. While all cases of colonialism might have this feature, not everything which implies a relation of structural domination can be classified as colonialism. Thus, the terms colonialism and post-colonialism pose problems. Beginning in the late 1970s and early 1980s, a field of academic study emerged which went by the name post-colonial studies. While recognizing a common heritage and indebtedness to earlier critical reflective practitioners and political thinkers such as Frantz Fanon and Gandhi, this new generation of theorists, instead of thinking of post-colonialism primarily as a form of historical periodization, began to use the term to refer to a mode of theoretical analysis concerned with questions of identity, representation, hybridity, diaspora, migration, rather than with direct anti-colonial struggle. Post-colonial criticism pursues not merely the inclusion of the marginalized literature of colonial people into the dominant canon and discourse. It also offers a fundamental critique of the ideology of colonial domination and at the same time seeks to undo the imaginative geography of Orientalist thought, according to Edward Said, who produced this concept and as well as focus on the economic divides between the West and the East, the civilized and the uncivilized, the first and third worlds. In this respect, post-colonial criticism is an activist form of critical theory. While post-colonial criticism emerged in the historical moment following the collapse of the modern colonial empires, the increasing globalization of culture, including the neo-colonialism and multinational capitalism, suggests its continued relevance. Indeed, this field of critical theory has found its way into central debates in almost all disciplines of the humanities and social sciences, including comparative literature, history, political studies, sociology, anthropology, and so on. Questions that arise in post-colonial critical theory are, for instance, is there a self-description and self-determination by way of contrast to one's other, a general or a universal feature of identity formation at the individual and at the collective level? Or is it a peculiar Western logic as Michel Foucault and Jacques Derrida, among others, have claimed. Another question is, how has this self-understanding and cultural representations of the West relied upon the constructed images of all these others? A third question is, how does the desire for unity and stability of identity amongst communities serve to efface internal heterogeneity and thus facilitate the silencing of, or worse, the actual violence against marginalized people within the system, such as women of color, sexual minorities, and so on? And finally, is there a means of representing, speaking of, or even speaking to, or letting these subalternatized peoples speak, to use the term introduced by Gayatri Spivak? On your screen, you can see the evolution of European empires since 1942. Along the previous questions, there are many others that we can pose regarding post-colonial critical theory. For example, how does the literary text explicitly or allegorically represent various aspects of colonial oppression? What does the text reveal about the problematics of post-colonial identity, including the relationship between personal and cultural identity within cultural borderlands? What persons or groups does the work identify as other or strangers? How are such persons or groups described and treated? What does the text reveal about the politics and or the psychology of anti-colonial resistance? What does the text reveal about the operations of cultural difference, the ways in which race, religion, class, cultural beliefs, customs all combine to form individual identity in shaping our perceptions of ourselves and of others? How does the literary text in the Western canon reinforce or undermine colonialist ideology through the representation of colonization and the colonized people? According to the Oxford Dictionary, colonialism is the policy or practice of acquiring full or partial control, military, political, and economic, over another territory, occupying it with settlers and exploiting it economically. The practice of colonialism sought to shape the identities of the colonized people using a process called othering, where the colonized was seen as different and lesser than the colonizer. There were various different types of colonization: invasion and settlement, internal colonialism, neocolonialism, cultural imperialism, and also immigration, diaspora, and globalization. Among the first strategies employed in colonization were what is called the white man's burden, an obligation to civilize non-Western peoples, trade, the control of migratory flows, social Darwinism and control of race and color, cultural imperialism, as well as conquest, war, and neocolonialism. And later strategies include nativism, which is political policy of promoting the interest of the native inhabitants against those of immigrants, mimicry, and multiculturalism. Along the lines of the lecture, we will explain some of these. Often taken 1415 as a starting point, the establishment of the first Portuguese colonial post in Ceuta, in North Africa, and also 1492, the first trip by Christopher Columbus to America, and also the settlement, Portuguese settlement at Fort Cochin in Kerala, in India, in 1503, academics have mapped the emergence of modern imperial power, which was first centered in the Western European territories and subsequently in its colonies or ex-colonies, particularly the United States and its global extension. Ania Lomba writes that by the 1930s, colonies and ex-colonies cover 84.6% of the land surface of the globe. Only parts of Arabia, Persia, Afghanistan, Mongolia, Tibet, China, Siam, and Japan had never been under formal European government. The global expansion of European power and subsequent reduction in the complex diversity of forms of life, modes of production, languages, cultures, and ecological relationships is part of all this process of colonization. As a form of economic and political dominance, colonialism was a process of dramatic consequences, some of which continue to manifest themselves in the countries called the Third World. The cultural consequences of colonialism accompany domination and are in charge of naturalizing it and justifying it. This awareness of the involvement of Western literary and scientific discourses in the expansion of the empire has led to a two-way process. First, a rereading and reinterpretation of the meaning of works based on their collusion with the empire, and secondly, a rewriting from the point of view of the colonized. British decolonization had begun much earlier with the independence of the American colonies in 1776. After the signing of the Declaration of Independence on the 4th of July. It is important to remember that the struggle against British tyranny as part of the American revolutionaries was often understood as complementary to the wars of extermination and dispossession against indigenous nations in what could be interpreted as forms of internal colonization. The cartoon on your screen depicts John Bull, which was the national personification of the United Kingdom in general and of England in particular. He's dressed like an English country squire, and the myth originated in 1712 as a satirical character which was created by John Arbuthnot, who was a friend of Jonathan Swift and Alexander Pope, and he created the character in a pamphlet entitled Law is a Bottomless Pit. And the artist William Hogarth and other intellectuals made John Bull a sort of heroic archetype of the free-born Englishman. After independence, the American colonies experienced a period of nation building into the United States, with writers such as the poet Whitman or the members of the Transcendentalist group, through which art and literary production focused in giving an identity to the new nation. And after that, there was a series of transatlantic encounters. And particularly in the 20th century, American writers such as Henry James or Ernest Hemingway, and poets like T.S. Eliot or Ezra Pound traveled extensively in Europe and introduced new forms of literary expression, such as the stream of consciousness technique, and became involved in various forms of avant-garde and modernism. At the same time, in the 1960s, we begin to see the emergence of minorities and ethnic groups within the United States that are also claiming their own voice, and I will mention them later. So during these years, in the 1960s, Europe experienced a huge wave of counter-cultural influence coming from the United States. For example, authors such as William Carlos Williams or Allen Ginsberg and the Beat Generation became international literary models, creating at the same time a form of neocolonialism or indirect cultural domination that continues until today, because most of the technological enterprises we use to communicate, Google, Facebook, Twitter, etc., are all based in the United States. There has also been considerable cross-fertilization between Eurocentric and Euro-American philosophy and post-colonial theory, particularly with scholars interested in comparative studies. Amid colonial expansion, the first chair of comparative literature was created at the University of Lyon in France in 1897, and in 1899, the first department dedicated to comparative literature was founded at Columbia University in New York. The implications of comparative literature in the sphere of colonial and post-colonial movements cannot be underestimated. From its inception, comparative literature was presented as a discipline that sought to overcome the limitations of national literatures. First, basing the discipline in comparison amid European literatures, but with the intent to expand comparison across the world. Some of the new independent nations, such as India, produce one of the oldest journals in comparative literature, established by Ananta Sharan Shukla, former professor of English at Salvanpur University, and René Velek, as well as other comparatists in 1977. And published by a local institute in the district of Odisha, which is one of the poorest in India. In their 1949 volume on literary theory, which is a landmark, René Velek and Austin Warren reiterated the need to rewrite literary history on a supranational scale, a task for which it was necessary that comparatists, in addition to knowing different languages, were able to overcome isolated attention to national literature. And in this process, comparatists were inspired by Goethe's concept of Weltliteratur, world literature. So you can find more about this concept in another video lecture that will explore world literature today. Returning now to the instruments of colonization, I will enumerate a few. First, the idea of the white man's burden, a concept taken from a poem by Rudyard Kipling entitled The White Man's Burden, the United States and the Philippine Islands. This is from 1899, when Kipling was actually residing in the United States, and he wrote the poem to celebrate the Diamond Jubilee of Queen Victoria 2 years before, on 22nd of June, 1897. It was first published in the Times in London, and soon after in several American newspapers, including the New York Sun. And it celebrates the Philippine-American War, which took place between 1899 and 1902. And the poem exhorts the United States to assume colonial control of the Filipino people and their country. And of course, you can explore yourselves the relationship to our own intervention in the Philippines, because this was the moment of the last of the participation of Spain in Los Últimos de Filipinas. So based on Kipling's poem, the cartoon shows a white adventurer carrying a wild beast over his shoulder. You can see this on your screen. The white man is labeled with the US written on his what he's carrying, and so he's representing the imperialist United States in the 19th century. And he's carrying the beast to the schoolhouse because Europeans believed that it was their responsibility to educate and civilize. No? The American flags are in the background, and they show that the land is being occupied by America, and the man is shown going uphill to emphasize the struggle because the beast does not want to be educated. The different empires were controlled by a government from the metropolitan center of the different European nation states. Imperialism extended and continued to extend control over territories by means of the establishment of trading companies, as well as political, ideological, economic, and social practices. And you have a quotation there from Edward Said in his book Culture and Imperialism from 1965. Its very investment in culture makes imperialism a force that exists far beyond a geographical empire. The Berlin Conference took place in 1884 and 85, and it was also known as the Congo Conference, and regulated European colonization and trade in Africa during the new imperialist period that coincided with Germany's sudden emergence as an imperial power. We will mention this in the second video when we talk about Joseph Conrad and Heart of Darkness very briefly. So the conference was organized by Otto von Bismarck, the first Chancellor of Germany, and contributed to increase colonial activity by eliminating existing forms of African autonomy and self-governance. In the map on your screen, you can see the different African territories that were still exploited by European powers after the Second World War. An example of North American colonization in the Pacific is the Newlands Resolution, which was a joint resolution passed on July 4th, 1898, by the United States Congress, and it was aimed at the annexation of the independent Republic of Hawaii. 2 years later, Congress created the territory of Hawaii, which became a state in 1959. For the problems generated by Japanese immigrants in Hawaii, for example, you can watch a video that was done by my colleague, Patsy Iwasaki from Hawaii University, about her graphic novel, which deals with the topic of internal immigration in colonial territories. In this case, Japanese immigrants in Hawaii. And you can find the video among the webinars on your page on critical theory, and I recommend you to watch it. She's the author of a graphic novel that deals with this topic and is very, very interesting. And her video, it's also worth watching. American sociologist, historian, civil rights activist William Edward Du Bois noted that modern societies are constituted through racialization. Racism was exported through conquest and invasion in the 15th and 16th centuries to all the European colonies. In the 18th and 19th centuries, ideological discourses, including philosophy and religion, and also scientific theories, tried to prove the superiority of white men. According to Du Bois, African American writing often displays a double consciousness, as he called it, arising from this bicultural identity and encompassing irony, parody, and sometimes bitter comedy in negotiating this ambivalence. It also attacks the presumed white cultural superiority, a naturalistic focus on survival, and an inventing reframing of language in many of these works, as we will see later. In the United States, the Harlem Renaissance, which took place between 1918 and 1937, signaled a tremendous upsurge in Black culture, with an especial interest in primitivist art and the so-called neo-Negroes. And one of the figures is, for example, the poet Langston Hughes, who was a prominent member of the Harlem Renaissance, a movement that engaged many writers, Black writers and intellectuals, in intense debate regarding the place of the African American in American life and the role of identity of the African American artists. The system of colonial racial differentiation set out Eurocentric foundations across the world, as Langston Hughes denounces in the following poem.
Hold fast to dreams, for if dreams die, life is a broken-winged bird that cannot fly. Hold fast to dreams, for when dreams go, life is a barren field, frozen with snow.
Besides, the racial differentiation system also intersected with the hegemonic patriarchal system. This constituted the coloniality of gender. The coloniality of gender produces positions of masculine superiority and feminine inferiority within race. In the intersection with colonialism and racism, these categories are complicated, and when masculinity is racialized as black and brown, it is considered animalistic and, as such, violent and inferior. At the same time, femininity, coupled with black or brown masculinity, can be considered inferior and an object of sexualized exploitation and violence. This relationship between colonialism and gender emerges particularly after the 1960s, and it is evident, for instance, in the novels by Canadian author Margaret Atwood. Her first novel, The Edible Woman, published in 1969, and her second, Surfacing, from 1972, received much critical attention. Atwood's works reflect on the controversies around gender equality, social injustice, and power struggle. Her quote on your screen is illustrative in this regard. The one good thing to be said about announcing yourself as a writer in the colonial Canadian 50s is that nobody told me I couldn't do it because I was a girl. They simply found the entire proposition ridiculous. Writers were dead, and English, or else extremely elderly and American. They were not 16 years old and Canadian. Another important aspect in colonization is the control of migratory flows. Transatlantic migration in America, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, South Africa was foundational to the creation of these nation-states as countries, defining themselves in the 18th and 19th centuries as countries of settlers and immigrants. Public discourses of these nation-states on national, cultural, and linguistic representations have oscillated between negation or partial acknowledgement of the transcultural fabric of their societies. And until today, these national narratives silence the exploitation and dehumanization of the indigenous populations in these territories. As in other countries in Latin America, the African presence was mostly due to the transatlantic slave trade between the 16th and 19th centuries. However, much of this information has been omitted from the histories and historiographies of modern Latin American nation-states. Approximately 13 million people from West and East Africa were enslaved and shipped to Europe and the Americas. Alongside the white man's burden, the control of migratory flows, relations of global trade, the organization of waged and unwaged labor, the division of work, and in short, all the modes of production and social reproduction of global capitalism continue to be organized by the racial matrix sustained by colonialism. For example, the open door policy was established by the United States in the late 19th century and early 20th century, and it continues to mediate the competing interests of different colonial powers. It allowed for a system of trade, for example, in China, open to various European countries on an equal basis. Different forms of cultural imperialism, which is again another form of colonialism, were employed in creating binary oppositions to define the colonial subjects and the colonizing masters. For example, the West was civilized, just, moral, industrious, rational, masculine. The Orient was savage, lazy, superstitious, feminine. This differentiation between citizen and non-citizen, alien and others, continues to regulate access to the labor market, education, political participation, the health system, media, cultural representations by means of the control of migratory channels and other means. Neocolonialism or neo-imperialism is a practice of using capitalism, globalization, and cultural imperialism to influence a developing country in lieu of direct military control, which was called imperialism before, or indirect political control, hegemony. The term was introduced by the French philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre in his 1956 book, Colonialism and Neocolonialism. And the term was first used by Kwame Nkrumah, former president of Ghana, in 1963, as a preamble that he addressed to the Organization of African Unity Charter, and he also used it in the title of his book from 1965 on Neocolonialism, the Last Stage of Imperialism. And you have a quotation here from this book. The result of neocolonialism is that foreign capital is used for the exploitation rather than for the development of the less developed parts of the world. Investment under neocolonialism increases rather than decreases the gap between the rich and the poor countries of the world. The struggle against neocolonialism is not aimed at excluding the capital of the developed world from operating in less developed countries. It is aimed at preventing the financial power of the developed countries being used in such a way as to impoverish the less developed. The first period of formalized decolonization started during the First World War in 1914. During this period, the colonial status of many of these territories ended, in many cases through wars of national liberation, and in other cases through negotiation and legal settlement. After the Second World War, decolonization took a faster pace, followed by sociocultural and political national movements in many former colonies. But many territories continued in the control of European states until 1949. For instance, this is the case of India. India had been colonized by the Portuguese in the late 15th century, and in 1600s, the Dutch began to establish several outposts in the territory, as you can see in the video. In 1613, England began to establish itself along with other European powers. And in the early 1700s, France had expanded its control over all the east coast of India and part of its central areas. After 1757, the British presence grew exponentially and only began to decrease after the First World War. As the former American colonies that had become independent in 1776, India had enjoyed a certain level of self-rule, And after the First World War, the movement for greater autonomy grew, encompassing various sections of society and undergoing constant ideological evolution. A strong socialist and anti-colonial orientation began to support the vision of independence, coupled with a secular, democratic, republican, and civil libertarian political structure. Ultimately, this led to the Indian Independence Act in 1947, which ended Indian colonial rule and the creation of Pakistan. India remained a dominion of the British Crown until the 26th of January 1950, when the Constitution of India came into force, establishing the Republic of India. Pakistan was a dominion until 1956. In 1971, East Pakistan declared independence as the People's Republic of Bangladesh. In the case of some of the British territories and dominions, there was a recovery of the vernacular languages coexisting in many cases with English speaking, particularly among the educated elites. In Ireland, North America, alongside Commonwealth countries such as Malta, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, India, Sri Lanka, South Africa, all of them had long histories of literature in English. Before the post-colonial revival, writers who chose to write in their local languages were considered provincial and enjoyed less visibility and prestige. Also, many writers like Catherine Mansfield or Jean Rhys or Salman Rushdie chose to emigrate to the metropolis and write back from there about the problems of the former colonial empire. Post-colonial studies emerged from the desire to analyze the cultural consequences of the processes of colonization and decolonization, and under this term, interpretative theories and practices are included. As with feminist studies, a first wave of post-colonial studies focused on the discursive products that generated European imperial dominance, and on the decolonization processes that took place, particularly after the second half of the 20th century. Comparative literature was then forced to move its initial Eurocentrism and became permeable to the development of new forms of sociocultural analysis and critical categories. The Canadian novelist Jack Hodgins from British Columbia expresses the intensity with which the anti-colonial movement struggled to define itself in those years, withdrawing from the notion of empire and focusing on the local. And you have a quotation on your screen from an interview for Kuna Pipi journal, Post-colonial Writing and Culture, in 1987. I have always been aware of the need to invent a literature which can reflect life in this place, to use the English language in the particular way it is used here, to find ways of unlearning the forms which were imposed upon us as inferior colonials who were expected to imitate the language and literature of the old world, and to create something new that says, this is us, this is how we are, this is how we name things and how we use language and make it ours. Hodgins' view reflects the larger historical movement of decolonization. Writing his Finnegan's Wake in the 1930s and 40s, James Joyce had already attempted to break with the English language, as many studies on Joyce and post-colonial and Irish identity have shown. Such self-conscious assertion of independent identity was a necessary revolutionary phase against imperialist powers who sought to diminish local cultural manifestations and writings. Joyce's biographer, Richard Ellman, reports the following statement from the Irish writer, and you have the statement on your screen. Among the Irish writers who adopted the English language in the 17th and 18th centuries and almost forgot their native land are found the names of Berkeley, the idealist philosopher, Oliver Goldsmith, author of The Vicar of Wakefield, two famous playwrights, Richard Brinsley Sheridan and William Congreve, whose comic masterpieces are admired even today on the sterile stages of modern England, Jonathan Swift, author of Gulliver Travels, which shares with Rabelais the place of the best satire in world literature, and Edmund Burke, whom the English themselves called the modern Demosthenes and considered the most profound orator who had ever spoken in the House of Commons. And in spite of everything, Ireland remains the brain of the kingdom. The Irish, condemned to express themselves in a language not their own, have stamped on it the mark of their own genius and compete for glory with the civilized nations. This is then called English literature. After the Second World War, the universities created in different territories started to play a significant role in the development of the new post-colonial literary pursuits. The takeoff of Nigerian literature in English can be traced directly to the universities of Ibadan and Nsukka, and the newspapers like The Horn and Black Orpheus and the Bari Press. A new generation of African writers, artists, musicians has emerged to establish a powerful African identity. Traditional arts like sculpture, music, dance also became new means of expressing African identity, and artists began to produce traditional pieces like masks, musical instruments, sculptures carved from wood, cast in bronze, and incorporating new ideas, materials into the works, reviving all African art into new vitality, creativity, and part of the world market today. Among those writers in Nigeria, for example, we can talk about Hall Soyinka or G.P. Clark, Christopher Okipbo, Gabriel Okara. They were all associated with these overlapping university circles. Soyinka is a poet, novelist, actor, director, filmmaker, and a critic, as well as a university professor of English and drama. After independence, African writers shifted from criticism of European colonialism to criticism of African leaders, and Soyinka spent time in prison for opposing Nigerian government, and he became the second Commonwealth writer to be awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1986. Many writers faced censorship, harassment, by African governments, and they were also ridiculed. Other African writers fled Africa to escape possible imprisonment. In Nigeria, G.P. Clark is also a translator, dramatist, literary critic, theater director, and professor of English. Similar scenarios occurred in other places, with academic journals and different creative actions established in support of the arts. In the 1930s, a group of African Caribbean students living in Paris founded the Negritude movement, or the Movement of Blackness, which was considered the first step in claiming post-colonial literary expression. One of the works that contributed to this change in perspective was the volume edited by the Senegalese Léopold Sédar Senghor, Anthologie de la Nouvelle Poésie Nègre et Malgache de la Langue Française, in 1948. And it was an anthology of poems written in French by authors of African and Caribbean origin. It was introduced by a prologue by Jean-Paul Sartre entitled Orphée Noire, where the philosopher reflects on the lyrical and political force of this new literary expression that was defined under the term blackness. So, la négritude was the term coined by the writer from Martinique, M. Césaire, in 1939, and it helped define magazines such as L'Étudiant Noir from 1934 and other editorial projects like those of the publisher Présence Africaine from 1947, which served as a space for the vindication of the Black culture of the African and Caribbean colonies. This Black culture is not defined positively, but as the reverse of white supremacy, and it uses nationalist attributions that draw a mythical positive image of Blackness and stereotypical portraits of the white invaders. Within this movement, it is important to mention the work of Frantz Fanon, Peau Noire, Masque Blanche from 1952, and Le Dame de la Terre from 1961, which introduced some of the themes that will contribute to become the pillars of post-colonial criticism, especially the way in which discursive representations, literary and scientific, function as yet another imperialist instrument and promote alienation of the colonized, as well as the role of literature in the national construction of the former colonies. According to Fanon, literature can play a decisive role against that imposed symbolism by building a collective imaginary where Black can reflect its identity and disengage itself from the white perceptions that cloud its experience. So Fanon introduces an interpretation of colonial discourse as textuality that contributes to imperialist expansion, but also the idea that it can also lead to cultural misalignment, that is, allowing the representation of the colonized and their own voices. So perhaps the most interesting contribution by Fanon is to the field of post-colonial studies lies in highlighting how cultural products travel and settle in the colonies together with the metropolitan army and administration. So this discursive perception of imperialism has been one of the most productive aspects of post-colonial studies and was also emphasized by Michel Foucault, as we will see later. As we have mentioned, in the 1960s, many of the ex-colonies of Africa, the Caribbean, and other parts of the world began to adopt centralized one-party political systems where a single political party controlled the government. Dictators ruled many nations, maintaining power through patronage, giving local followers well-paid positions in the government, and some corrupt officials required bribes for government contracts, licenses, and they ran government enterprises for personal profit. During the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union gave large amounts of money to these dictators who were friendly to their sides. So after the Cold War ended, all these funds, all this money dried up, and this weakened some of the dictators' governments. So that these dictators resorted to fraud and intimidation in order to win elections. Other territories in the Commonwealth enjoyed faster economic and educational development, and local literatures began to receive more attention as part of the emerging national consolidation, with a vigorous support for local arts, courses in national literature, the establishment of publishing houses, as we have mentioned before, and so on. We have mentioned several territories of the Commonwealth, Canada, and I want to mention now the Australian writer Patrick White, who was awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1973 for an epic on psychological narrative, which introduced, in his words, a new continent into literature. And he used this expression in his citation and address to the Swedish Academy. Still, many post-colonial writers had to travel to Britain and to the metropolis in order to find a market and establish a reputation. In the case of the Caribbean, we find many paradoxes of alienation present in the works, for example, of V.S. Naipaul, for instance, in The House for Mr. Visvas from 1961. And we see this also in the African dilemmas present in the novels by Kenyan writer Ngugi wa Thiong'o, like, for example, Petals of Blood from 1978, and also in his critical reflections in the volume entitled Writers in Politics from 1981. In this volume, he strives to offer a reinterpretation of the anti-imperialist struggles and the author's ability to participate in the political process of the emerging nations. In the case of Naipaul, he writes about the injustices suffered by the Indian population in territories where the majority of the population was black. For example, his native Trinidad Tobago. For this reason, he is sometimes regarded as anti-black and even neo-colonialist, since his novels do not conform to the widely accepted view of the West Indies as a place where the blacks are the victims. In Naipaul's novels, we can recognize an attempt to show the complex origin of feelings of ruthlessness and racial alienation that happened after the Second World War, when all these nations became independent, and they were populated by people who were brought from many different territories during the colonial period for exploitation. And for example, novels that focus on this by Naipaul are Finding the Center and An Enigma of Arrival. As indicated, many of the literatures in this period turn to protest, reflecting concerns with the relationship of the written and oral traditions during the colonial period. I have mentioned the relationship between post-colonial critical theory and comparative literature. In the 1970s, there was a strengthening of the collaboration with various other forms of critical theory. For example, cultural materialism, cultural studies, feminist criticism, and queer studies, among other various types. Some of these propose models of cross-cultural analysis that were in conflict with those held by post-colonial studies. And this questioning extended to the writings in the languages of the empires that appear in the former colonial territories, as well as the significance of the multilingual contacts and discursive appropriation that colonization and decolonization left behind. So three broad areas emerge from these complex relationships: post-colonial politics, post-colonial theory, and post-colonial ethics. As we have mentioned, initially, the new literatures showed a strong rejection for values imported from the colonial period and moved in conjunction with nationalist movements, featuring native culture, local subject matter, folk art, native myths, local language, national pride, and all this narrative related to the political independence and demands for social justice. For example, we have Chinua Achebe, the Nigerian writer, novels, for example, Things Fall Apart from 1958 and The Arrow of God from 1964. They present a very active African society corrupted by the European colonial exploits. In many cases, after independence, the national governments expected intellectuals to continue to support this nationalism, but many writers chose to move away from the anti-colonial rhetoric. And they continued, however, to use a selective view of culture, sometimes idealized, as it happens in Things Fall Apart by Achebe, where he uses songs, legends, rituals, oral tales, and history in contrast to foreign influences. In this respect, some post-colonial literary creations need to be viewed bearing in mind that the depiction of history is filtered through the fictional, and that in many of these nations, as for example in the case of Nigeria, there was no consciousness of unitary nationalism prior to colonization and decolonization, since the territory consisted on a number of different tribes with their own languages and cultures. The revival of local languages in Ireland, India, or Israel is typical of a nationalistic attempt to forge an identity through language. Many intellectuals defended that national literature should be written in the local languages. English, however, survived, first as the second language of the elite and the ruling classes, and later as the language of international communication and commerce, evolving to adapt itself to the various communities and form what has been termed local forms of Englishes. So, for example, Achebe's Things Fall Apart is a classic example in its use of Igbo proverbs. This is a local language, Igbo, from Nigeria, and transliteration from this language to English, creating a form of Nigerian English that functions as an example of the appropriation of the Western genre to the point of view of the colonized. So Achebe writes in English and defends that this option is the only one that can allow Nigeria, a country made up of different communities, to express themselves in one national literature. Achebe notes that both the English literature in Nigeria and the country's internal differences and borders are the result of the same colonial process. So he asserts that the use of native languages often requires native writers to put forth the double effort of writing in the local language and then translating the work into English or having it translated. Another Nigerian writer, Christopher Okigbo, is of a similar mind, thinking that although he must assert his native culture, he has, in order to avoid being swamped by the Western culture, he can use a mixture of English and his local language as a strategy. And away from Nigeria, we have the example of Derek Walcott from the West Indies. He's a poet and a dramatist, and he uses a spectrum of diverse kinds of English, from standard to dialects. You have a quotation there from the Schooner Flight where he explains the following: I had a sound colonial education. I have Dutch, Nigger, and English in me, and either I am nobody or I am a nation. So Walcott also pointed out that multiracial communities and nations continue to be immersed in power relations, and that post-colonial literature should make an effort between these opposite pulling powers. So some writers would remain in the protest tradition, while others, like Walcott, would encourage a dialogue between imperial artistic conventions in order to articulate local realities. Walcott is another of the post-colonial writers who received the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1992. To give another example, from all the different territories, the poetry of many Indian authors also gained popularity in their India English forms. So among the topics that they tackle was the topic of diasporic communities and memories of space and place, archetypal echoes and myths, the topic of hybridity, homeliness and unhomeliness, in between spaces and borderlands, the topic of alienation, syncretism, xenophobia, friction and conflicts between different generations of peoples, and also dialogism within diasporic communities. The topic of multiracial nations and the conflict of power relations that takes place in them is also visible in many movies, and you have a few examples in the following part of the video. For example, the movies Shala from 1974, Sugarcane Alley from 1984, Mississippi Masala from 1992, and Whale Rider from 2004. I will show you some little bits of their trailers.
Jamais dans le passé, un Africain n'a occupé la présidence de notre chambre. Face à notre peuple, notre indépendance est complète. Cette date mémorable, nous sommes conviés au mariage de notre honorable collègue Elhaj Abdoukader Bey.
It's a long way from India to Mississippi.
I'm a mixed masala.
Hot and spicy, huh?
Academy Award winner Denzel Washington.
I ain't no saint. Just looking at her make me break into a sweat. Sweat all over the chicken.
You know what they say to me? Your brother thought he got himself a white chick.
I love him.
What about his family?
You think I ain't good enough for your daughter, is that it?
I never thought I would fall in love with you.
Mississippi Masala, rated R.
A long time ago, my ancestor Paikea came to this place, on the back of a whale. Since then, in every generation of my family, the firstborn son has carried his name and become the leader of our tribe.
Her name's Spike.
No, not that name.
Until now.
When she was born, that's when things went wrong for us. I'm gonna need all the firstborn boys. That's where we'll find the answer. This will be a sacred school of learning. You'll be taught in all the qualities of a chief. I go to the back.
How come you ain't let you do it?
Girls aren't allowed.
Make your enemies feel the fear.
He's got a lot of rules he has to live by.
It's not fair.
Keep her away. It's distracting for the boys.
That old pucker's not the only one who knows some tricks.
Could you teach me?
Yes.
You will be tested for your strength, good, your courage.
So we have seen that for some authors, like for example, the Nigerian Achebe or Derek Walcott in the Caribbean, the use of English helps give visibility to post-colonial writers. But others, like the Kenyan Ngugi wa Thiong'o, they understand that for a writer from a former colonist to use the language of the metropolis as a language of expression is a form of neocolonialism that ensures the promotion of the minority who dominates the language of the empire, excluding, for instance, the languages of the working classes. So for this Kenyan author, the problem of intellectuals who choose to write in English is that they limit their audience by acting as if their local languages were not alive. So this debate has been termed exophony, the expression of those who decide to publish from the colonies not in their mother tongues, but in the language of the metropolis. And it continues to be a debate which it's still happening in the field of critical theory because many publishing houses still give more visibility to authors and critics who write in English and in European languages. For example, there was a convention held in 1962 in Makerere University in Uganda under the slogan, "A Conference of African Writers of English Expression." And this is often mentioned as a key moment in the language debate because the conference excluded from the meeting all African writers who did not write in English, either because they expressed themselves in other metropolitan languages like French or Portuguese or Spanish, or because they used languages of African origin. In the 1970s and 80s, the continuation of anti-colonial symbols can be understood as an attempt to keep the people united and energized in the new nations, sometimes in order to distract attention from the continuing inequalities and problems, dictatorships, and so on after independence. The complexities of post-colonial writing can be seen in all these tensions. To give some examples from South Africa, Nadine Gordimer's views are strongly anti-apartheid, and they showed sympathies for both Black Africans and white Afrikaners as victims of British colonialism in South Africa. You can see this, for example, in her novels, The Conservationist from 1975 or Burger's Daughter from 1979. The anti-apartheid movement had started in the 1940s with key members such as Nelson Mandela. In 1952, Mandela organized a campaign urging the Black people in South Africa to break apartheid laws, and in the 60s, the movement changed from a peaceful philosophy to activism after the police killed demonstrators in Sharperville. So Mandela was jailed, and in the 1970s, major student protests took place in Soweto, for example, and police crushed the uprising, and over 600 people were killed and 4,000 wounded. The international community imposed trade sanctions on South Africa after this event. And not until the 1990s, negotiations began to enact a new constitution and the end of apartheid, and Mandela was released from prison. In 1994, he became the first Black president of the democratic South Africa. In Latin America, the so-called testimonial literature appeared also in the 70s and the 80s, and it can be also placed under a category termed symbolic autobiography, which, according to Eleke Boehmer, in her volume Migrant Metaphors, Colonial and Postcolonial Literature from 1995, she explores several biographies and autobiographies, such as the biography of a runaway slave from 1966 by Miguel Barnett, or My Name is Rigoberta Menchú, and This is How My Political Consciousness Was Born from 1983 which was co-authored by Rigoberta Menchú and Elizabeth Burgos. And these are examples of these memories and autobiographies where the protagonist's political involvement transcends personal experience and they become part of the reflection of the community. So Eleke Boehmer calls these collective biographies. And on the other hand, we have also narratives that try to represent other cultural lives of the group. For example, she mentions Acheve's Things Fall Apart, and which narrates the change suffered by the Igbo indigenous community in Nigeria. In both cases, the search for identity is a significant trait of post-colonial literature. In the 1990s, several other fields began to interact and intersect with post-colonial studies. We have seen how the field has evolved through the 1960s, the 1970s, and the 1980s. In the 90s, in the United States, we have fields such as area studies, or also called regional studies, that involves research and scholarship pertaining to a particular geographical, national, and cultural region. We have ethnic studies, which has a very obvious historical relationship with post-colonial theory, in that Euro-American imperialism and colonization in the last 4 centuries involved forms of external empire and internal forms of colonization, slaves, and which these ethnic studies was directed to these recognizable ethnic groups, in particular African and African American, but also Chinese, the peoples from migrant people from India, Latino, the Native American people, the Filipino people, and many others. And there's also the field of minority studies, which also concerns itself with art and literature produced by identifiable ethnic groups, which are either marginalized or are subordinate to the dominant culture. So the literary works of some of these groups can be classified simultaneously as post-colonial, but also as ethnic and minority literatures. And many focus on symbolic autobiography and collective biographies, as well as testimonial literature. Among the groups, the largest community are the Spanish-speaking people in the United States. The majority are from Puerto Rico, Mexican origin, and their main themes have to do with the concept of borders between nations and between cultures within nations. So some authors use forms of code switching, moving back and forth between Spanish and English, again in a similar way to Achebe in Nigeria, and they also use Spanglish. A key concept among these writers is the concept of liminality and in-betweenness, and we will explore this concept a little bit more in the second video when we talk about Harvard professor Homi Bhabha, who is one of the most important post-colonial theorists. Afro-Caribbean and African writers have made significant early contributions to the theory and practice of ethnic criticism and post-colonial criticism, exploring traditions that have been suppressed or gone underground in literary activity. We have already mentioned W.E.B. Du Bois, where we find an early attempt to theorize the position of African Americans within dominant white culture through his concept of double consciousness, a dual identity including both American and Negro. So Du Bois and other theorists after him seek an understanding of how this double experience creates an identity that reveals itself in culture. And among the recent scholars and writers, we have Henry Louis Gates, Toni Morrison, and Anthony Appiah, and they have brought attention to the problems inherent in applying theoretical models and structures of thought derived from Eurocentric paradigms. And they have also explored vernacular traditions and racial groups that have been historically marginalized by the dominant cultures, in particular the Black groups. In the case of Native American literatures, these are the literatures of the local native population, the Indians in America, as they were called. We have two traditions. One that moves towards recovering the traditional native literature, including tales, songs, and mostly oral tradition, because they didn't have a written tradition then. And the second tradition is literature written in English again. Among the most popular writers, you have some there on your screen, but let me just mention Scott Momaday, his book A House Made of Dawn from 1968, which won the Pulitzer Prize, and and also his memoir in which he mixes fiction and poetry, and is entitled The Way to Rainy Mountain from 1969. So because these cultures were predominantly oral cultures, storytelling is passed on, and all the values, religious beliefs, political codes, and everything are learned from practical lessons in everyday life. For these Native American and other ethnic groups, stories are a source of strength, of cultural strength, that has been silenced for many years. Another group, these are all the groups in the United States, is the Asian Americans and Pacific writers, who write mostly biographical and testimonial stories again. Some of these are called paper son stories because they were carefully fabricated for Chinese immigrant men to make the authorities believe that their New World sponsors were really their fathers. No? So Asian American autobiography inherited these descriptive strategies, and we have some examples. For example, the Woman Warriors, Memoirs of Girlhood Among Ghosts by Maxine Hong Kingston. And these narratives emphasize that although identity may be individually known within, is not always at home in the outward community. So this alienation, no? And Chinese women make up the largest and most influential group of these Asian American writers. Another example is Jade Snow Wong, the fifth Chinese daughter, and there is a movie about this novel. Amy Tang is very prolific and very well known. Her one of her first novels is The Joy Luck Club from 1989, which traces the lives of 4 Chinese women immigrants starting in 1949. And they form a club and they tell their stories, tracing their origins to China. And one of my favorite authors is Eileen Chang, and I recommend her novella, Lost, which is an erotic novel that leads to, it deals with espionage in Hong Kong during the Chinese Revolution. And there is a 2007 movie adaptation, which is also an excellent watch. So to conclude this first video lecture on post-colonial studies, it can be seen how this is a very large field that provides literary studies with a reflection on the construction of the international canon and on the necessary localized and politicized position of critics and their discourses. On your screen, you can see a summary of the 3 phases through which most post-colonial writings have passed. In his article, Heroic Ethnocentrism, the Idea of Universality in Literature, from 1973, Charles Larson, who is a critic as well as a teacher, he was a teacher of English in Nigeria, he shows that the difficulties in conveying value differences across cultures. He argues that Western discourses identify certain values and conventions as universal, but this is not really so. And he explains that concepts such as the Western idea of love proved very difficult for him to teach and make his Nigerian students understand. In post-colonial works, counter-writing became a form of textual appropriation of the metropolis to create a discourse of resistance against false notions of universal categories, as we have seen. Formal procedures such as irony, parody, and the breaking of traditional narrative structures were forms of counter-writing, as the techniques used by Chinua Achebe in mixing English with local languages, also present in Derek Walcott novels and poems. No? Barbara Harlow uses the term resistance literature to refer to the discourse of resistance, and she affirms that it presents not only claims to social recognition, but also challenges the codes and canons of the literary theory and practice developed in the West. And finally, just to mention a French theorist of post-colonial studies, Jean-Marc Murat, and he explains that post-colonial literatures are born from the imperative of new emerging nationalisms and inscribe an identity that is both recovered and alienated. So this imperative is reflected in a desire to find indigenous forms of expression that, according to Murat, materialize in 3 different narrative types. Number 1, the story of reinterpretation of the old anti-imperialist struggle, such, for example, the presence in Gandhi's legacy. Number 2, the account of the lost community and therefore of a fullness of the pre-colonial tradition that imperialism has undergone. And number 3, the model that he calls symbolic autobiography, where it is intended to relate from a biographical experience the access to an entire people, an entire group of people. So the individual experience becomes communal, as we have mentioned before. So finally, we also need to bear in mind that new processes of neocolonialisms are taking place as we speak. In part 2 of this series on post-colonial studies, we will explore some of these aspects as well as the main critical theories.